Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Dan, that's Adam. And we have the coveted Friday afternoon on a rainy day in a windowless room immediately after lunch time slot. So we will do our best to entertain and engage you. But so Adam, welcome. I have to say, I have been looking forward to this for a very, very long time. A long time.
Seriously?
Seriously, a really long time. In fact, since March 2nd, 1979. I have in my hands, it's like a deposition here, I have a letter here. When I was in 8th grade in Columbus, Ohio, I gave a presentation about sports and business, and I asked the then NBA commissioner, Larry O'Brien, to come and be interviewed during that presentation in 8th grade in Columbus, Ohio. And he said no, but he sent me a lovely letter that I've kept to this day. And Adam can verify that.
Absolutely. Dear Mr. Pink, thank you for your recent letter.
There you go. Right.
But by the way, I think you should show this to people. We have.
I don't know if we can get a tight shot on this for the folks in the.
We have the same letterhead.
It looks that way. Yeah, yeah. But I do have a. Look at this.
Autographed picture of Larry O'Brien.
I have a signed, personalized picture of Larry O'Brien, the then NBA commissioner, which I got as a consolation prize for him not coming to Columbus. So when I say I've been waiting for this a long time.
Given your background, you have to fill people in on who Larry O'Brien was, what his job was before.
Oh, well, Larry O'Brien was an NBA commissioner who was an aide to both Kennedys?
Yes.
Yeah, both Robert and John Kennedy.
And he was the head of the Democratic Party, and it was his office that was broken into.
Oh, right, of course.
Watergate.
Right. He was the head of the DNC, and it was his office that was broken into. Yeah.
My predecessor.
Yeah. Any more questions? Okay. So I have been waiting a long time. This makes it 38 years. So I'm so pumped to be here. Let's start with this question here. What does the NBA commissioner do? I'm serious. It sounds like it's such a cool title. Like if I had the title NBA commissioner, I'd be so pumped, all right? But what do you actually do?
So I am so pumped to be the NBA commissioner. But it's, for us internally, it's actually more like a typical CEO job. I mean, we're a business that has $8 billion of revenue. If you aggregate all of our employees nationally and internationally, including all the people who work at our arenas, day of game, it's probably close to 50,000 people. So it's a business job at the end of the day. I mean, business from the standpoint that the way our organizations run, we have budgets, we do business planning, we have a communications department, a marketing department. But I mean, there's a public side of it. I think sometimes it's more analogous to a political position in some ways. Mm-hmm. I think you have a background in politics as well. But in essence, I run an organization and I report to a board. In the case of the NBA, our board is every NBA team, in essence, has one vote. So I have 30 bosses, and we have a board that meets 3 times a year and gives direction to the executives who are the league office.
And so in terms of how you spend, how do you spend a day? How much of time are you on the road? How many games do you see? How much time do you spend with players, with fans, with owners? Right,
I'm probably on the road about a third of the time. I go to a lot of games throughout the season. I try to get to all of our team cities at least once, which doesn't seem that difficult, but 30 teams and getting to games throughout the regular season isn't so easy. And when I'm there, I always try to spend time with fans. I mean, I sit in the stands, I go to games, I meet with owners on a regular basis, but also general managers, the team presidents. I see players throughout the year. Increasingly, players that are coming through New York, our office is in New York City, and players that are playing the Knicks or the Nets will often come by the office. The Union office is down the street from ours in New York as well. So they can stop by and.
Because if they're playing the Knicks, they don't need a lot of workout time. Yeah.
But so no, I mean I'm not going to bite. So.
In my due diligence, I found out that growing up you were a Knicks fan.
True.
You grew up in the New York area.
True, I was. But once I came to the league, I'm completely.
You love all your 30 children.
Precisely.
Right. So tell us. So this is a conference about analytics. Tell us how have analytics reshaped the NBA, both on the court, the great product that fans see on the court, but also in terms of how you oversee this very complex organization.
Yeah. So. Not surprisingly, analytics are part and parcel of virtually everything we do now. I'd say, one, I'll begin on the basketball side, and Kate mentioned a little bit in the introduction. I mean, analytics have become central to scouting. They become central to determining playing time of those players. I think biometrics and wearables are a critical part. Everything now is tracked in terms of our players. It's not just their movement on the court during games, but during practice. I'd say the vast majority of our players are wearing sleep monitors, or quantifying everything that goes into their bodies. We're spending an increasing amount of time looking at sort of our equivalent of big data when it comes to injuries, trying to the extent that the information can be predictive or helping players through rehabilitation. So, and then the very statistics that, fans grew up following when they were kids. And I think the fields have become more sophisticated in terms of what's followed. I mean, we have a partnership with a company called SAP, and so, and we've become very transparent in terms of that data as well. I mean, you can go on our website or our app and crunch virtually any data out there, but, where it used to just be the assist, it's now the assist leading to the assist.
Right.
I mean, it's amazing, and I think it's part of the result is, for example, that the plethora of three-point shots now that are being taken in our league, that they're smarter about the positioning on the floor, on optimizing a three-point shot from this precise position on the floor. I think the discussions with players, I mean, when on defense, they've had broken down for them every move of that player that they're covering. I mean, I think it's far more sophisticated than people might realize in terms of our game. And then on the business side, in some ways, we were later to the table than the basketball. We followed the basketball in analytics there. I mean, I'll begin one with ticket pricing, for example. Now, where certainly when we were kids, and even much later than that, if you bought a season ticket, it was the exact same price for every game. Or even if you wanted to buy a game against the Lakers, or a ticket against the Lakers, or it was against Detroit, it wouldn't matter. Every ticket was $50 or whatever it was. Now, the ticket, it's sort of like airline price optimization. I mean, that it's a different price often for every game, but also depending when you buy that ticket. So it's variable pricing. Right. So if you're buying that ticket 3 weeks before the matchup, it's a different price than day of. And even on day of, the price will move. There's what used to be called ticket scalping is now viewed as a very sophisticated secondary market for ticketing. Obviously, there's companies like StubHub, but our teams are doing it themselves through Ticketmaster. So there's what we call a ticket exchange. So in essence, games are hardly ever sold out anymore because there's presumably some price at which somebody's willing to sell a ticket, even if they maybe were otherwise planning to go. So it's become, again, very transparent, very robust in terms of a marketplace for tickets. I think analytics, when we have a group in our office we call Team Marketing and Business Operations, run by some very sophisticated MBAs who, in essence, act like a SWAT team, going from market to market and sharing best practices, but often a lot of that's based on analytics. Teams are sharing information. What's the optimal way to sell a season ticket, a suite, a sponsorship, and for our teams, even to the extent they're not using the expertise of those people, sort of much of that is qualitative, that from a quantitative standpoint, we're taking data from 30 teams at the league office and then turning around and crunching that data and sharing it back so that if teams are prospecting and they want to sell more sponsorships, they quickly see what the yield is from the banking category, from the credit card company, and all those things. And then I'd say same with our employees as well, increasingly using more analytics in terms of measuring their productivity, in terms of how we find employees, how we train employees. I think it's probably, it goes really to your initial question to me, what do I do? I think it's more of a typical CEO job than people might see from the outside. And I think our use of analytics, I think for especially the people who are here today, in many ways it's much more similar on a business side to the same way they would use analytics in their businesses.
Yeah. Can you give us a sense, we're at, this is a University of Pennsylvania sponsored event. We have a lot of students here. So let's say a typical, a business school student might be, say 25 years old, 26 years old. How is what we see on the court today different from what we saw 25 years ago on the court?
Well,
because of analytics.
Well, first, before you get to analytics, I think one thing that's different, and for example, people follow the NBA, the so-called resting issue has been very topical.
It was on my list.
Okay, well, so I think one of the differences is that there's not, you can obviously quantify precisely how many minutes, how many seconds a player is on the floor, and how many seconds or minutes a player was on the floor 25 years ago as opposed to today. Resting gets a lot more attention today because every game is now a national or global game. For people who follow the league, not only do we have more national games on television, remember it wasn't, 35 years ago or so, we still had our finals that were tape delayed.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So now, I mean, in addition to the ABC, ESPN, TNT games, that if you're a fan of the league, you can get an app, or on your computer, you can watch in high definition streaming every single game that's out there. And those highlights are therefore available, whether it's not just ESPN and SportsCenter, but literally thousands of websites are featuring those highlights, and whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever else. So every movement of every player is being tracked, and anything they do that might be either spectacular or embarrassing is also being tracked in a way that it wasn't even 25 years ago. And so even if a player was a different equivalent of resting, maybe a player was still going to play minutes in that game, but he was going to play fewer minutes, or frankly not play as hard because he legitimately was tired or fatigued. It wasn't noticed. And I think back, I mean, I've been with the league 25 years now, and even when I first got to the league, then our big national television package was with NBC. Coaches and players would circle those NBC games. Those were bigger games. It was a bigger platform, even for them to become better known, for bigger deals. We knew it, Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon, that game's going to be on NBC. They'd never miss it. So now, to today, so first of all, the scrutiny is much greater. And in terms of the analytics, what's now happening, and it's coming back to bite us a little bit in terms of the resting, is that began with San Antonio and Coach Popovich, and maybe because he had the stature to do it, and again, in a very sophisticated way, and I think what's lost sometime with the resting issue, it's being driven by the coaches and the GMs. It's not players raising their hands saying, please rest me.
The controversy here is that in really recent, like last month or so, where it's really, I think, really popped, is that some very well-known players have sat out certain games.
Right.
And which, if you buy a ticket to a Cavaliers game and Kyrie Irving, the great point guard, and LeBron James, the soon-to-be, the Hall of Fame superstar, are not playing, you feel, oh man, why did I come to see the Cavs? And so they're saying, so the fans say, and also the chatter on Twitter and sports radio, it's like, okay, these guys are really dogging it. And you're saying...
Well, and I'm saying, it just coincidentally, Magic Johnson just came back into the league as president of the Lakers, and I was in a meeting with him the other day, and there was another person in the meeting as well, and said something like, yeah, Magic, no one ever rested in your day. And he was like, well, actually, we rested. I mean, there were games, and Pat Riley used to rest me, but it was more... I think strategic in terms of it wouldn't have been a national game, et cetera. It's sort of every game is a national game now. And the issue sort of today has been, it's more a function of resting multiple players together. And now that goes to the analytics for a second, because I think what the coaches are seeing is that if we're going to rest players, I mean, they're optimizing their ability to win games. And I think what they're seeing is that if I'm going to rest a star, I might as well, in certain cases, rest other marquee players in the same night, because we've already dramatically decreased our chances of winning that game. Now, it's not the right result you want to see as a league, and it's something we're talking to our coaches about, but the analytics of resting are very sophisticated, where it goes to the biometrics and the wearables. They're tracking every movement of those players. They're measuring, in essence, their output. They're seeing indicators, and sometimes they're very sophisticated markers, even from in terms of saliva and other things, and saying that this player is fatigued. The correlation is clear between sort of fatigue and injuries. And so they're saying there's, in essence, red flags going up in a program and saying, maybe not be that exact moment, but that a player needs some rest. And again, it's not the players who are saying, please rest me. And I think from a fan standpoint, as frustrating as it may be for that fan who's come to that game, and you brought your son Noah, who I just met, to see a marquee game and star players, that it's going to be incredibly disappointing. But I think we all realize that, let's just say the analytics were such that you knew that if a player rested 3 days after playing 30 games, that there would be a 40% greater likelihood that he would not be injured as a result of resting. You would, in essence, be making that player available for even more fans. So we're going to have to find the right balance in the league. But to answer your question directly, the analytics have become front and center with precisely when players are rested, how many minutes they get, who they're matched up against, and they're looking at sophisticated data too. Back to what I said earlier about defenses, that 42% of the time this player goes left with his left foot. Sometimes idiosyncrasies of players that the players are trained to see, that a player will make a certain tell before making a certain move, and all of that is being scrutinized by teams to try to get an edge.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things, let's ask one question about the court, and then we'll talk more broadly about the NBA's role in the world in some cases. The three-point shot, right? The three-point shot, again, most baskets are worth 2 points, but if you shoot from beyond a certain range, it's worth 3. That's been around for a long time. And it didn't really take off, though, until recently. The three-point has been around for what?
I think 79.
All right, so that's a long time.
And it came from the ABA.
The ABA was the American Basketball Association, which was a rival league of the NBA in the 1970s, an incredible font of innovation and craziness. Right, and the NBA absorbed 4 of their teams in like 78.
76.
76, yeah. 76. They played with a red, white, and blue basketball. All kinds of great.
Who knew you were such a basketball historian?
There's a great book, and forgive me, the title is not a joke, but there's a great history of the ABA called Loose Balls. That is,
I think by Terry Pluto.
Terry Pluto, who was a reporter for the Akron newspaper. Right. Yeah. Anyway, but this is the point, though. You had this great innovation, three-point shot. Oh my gosh! But it took really 25 years.
And it was
for it to become really, really integrated into the game. Why do you think that is? Is there a kind of a risk aversion in certain professions that makes them less likely to adopt those kinds of innovations?
Yeah, so one, yes, risk aversion, and I think it was a time where there was very little use of analytics, and I think other sports led, certainly baseball, before it came to the NBA, and I think it was frowned on. It was viewed as, especially because it had come from the ABA, very much as a gimmick, a novelty. I think it was, and I've seen some early quotes from the great Celtic coach Red Auerbach, when the three-point shot came into the league, he was very critical of it. I mean, in the same way the Celtics were the last team to have a mascot, that tells you what he thought of the three-point shot. And I think as teams then, as I said earlier, got more sophisticated about the analytics, and it became a function of if you shoot, X% from the three-point line, 38% from the three-point line, the analytics quickly showed was better than 43% from the two-point line, or whatever the numbers are. And then it became more precise. If you notice, the three-point line is not equidistant from the basket.
Right.
It's closer from the corners. And so the three-point corner shot has a greater value to the teams than the center court three-point shot. And then what happened is, and I think here maybe it takes a generation to adapt, that the skills change of players. If you look at, so even the big men coming into the league now, even as the explosion began in three-point shooting, big men never took three-point shots. Now you look at, for example, Kristaps Porzingis, who's a second-year player for the Knicks. I mean, he shoots it like he were a guard.
And
because
he's 7'3".
Yeah, and so now
that's tall, 7'3".
Big men are growing up and learning to shoot. And so it takes a while for the players to adapt to the rules, but I think that, at the end of the day, a result of data.
Yeah, I think the generation point is an interesting one. I think for this group here, what's interesting is that you have a kind of cascading effect in that you have a rule change, all right? And the rule change basically changes some of the strategy of the firm, in this case, which would be the teams. But I think what happens then is that when you have the right analytics, it actually changes who you hire. And so what you see now, Adam, are players who are pretty short. I mean, a surprising number of players who are
absolutely
who are fairly short. Back in the old days, you had Calvin Murphy, who was like, 5 foot
10, 11,
10 or something like that. But now you have Isaiah Thomas Jr.
Right.
Tell us about that. I mean, what are the lessons there for the people out there who are looking for ways to hire? How do you follow that cascade from a rule change to a different skill set to looking for new talent?
One, I think this goes a little bit what you said a moment ago, that I think in certain cases, in terms of changes and trends in the league, even when the data is showing one thing, it still requires thought leaders. And I'd say in this case, a lot of credit goes to Greg Popovich in San Antonio, probably the most veteran coach we have in the league right now, and one of the most successful. And Phil Jackson before him, when Phil Jackson, even when he was more thoughtful in his approach to players and actually had players meditating and things like that sort of changed the approach to many players. And I think with Greg Popovich, even in terms of being more strategic in minutes for players, that changed the approach as well. And then what happens, about 10 years ago, there were some other rule changes in the league that made the game less physical. There was a sense that if you think back at, Anthony Mason or Charles Oakley, some of those old Knicks teams where they were just big guys who were, I think from a skill standpoint, less pure skill players, but also part of their strength as a player was that they were physically intimidating, that it became hard to drive towards the basket. And there was a view in the league that it had become, that we had diminished our product, that it wasn't as aesthetically pleasing as a game. And we were, talk about data, we could see through ratings, ticket sales, we were losing part of our fan base, saying that that's not the game that I grew up loving. And so a guy named Jerry Colangelo, who was the owner of the Phoenix Suns, led a task force that led to some rule changes. But in essence, you could no longer hand check the way you could. So it gave players the opportunity to celebrate their skills in a way they hadn't been able to. And I'd say there's a direct line that leads to not just to Isaiah Thomas, the one who plays for the Celtics now, but Steph Curry. Mm-hmm. Because if you think Steph Curry, I mean, he's not short by mortal standards.
Steph Curry, a one-time MVP, who's a star, two-time MVP,
yeah.
A star of the, one of the stars of the Golden State Warriors.
Warriors, who's, I think roughly 6'3", maybe 175 pounds.
Yeah,
but I mean,
guy.
But big,
Yeah.
but not by sort of traditional
Yeah.
7-foot NBA standards. And so these players, like Steph Curry, like Isaiah Thomas, could come in and showcase real basketball skills. And I think one of the things I've seen in the league over the years that it may be a bit of a cliche, but the little men try harder. Because if you think just from a data standpoint, you could chart it. Think in terms of the population, the bell curve of heights, that when you get over, 6'9" or something like that, it's a very small percent of the population.
Yeah.
And if you go below a certain, in terms of adult heights, it's much smaller. And the vast bulk of the people, let's say, are going to be closer to 5'9", 5'10", maybe curve starting to go down, but 6'3", you still have a larger pool of players. And so those players to break through from the time that they're kids,
right.
It's much more competitive in order to excel. And I think that when you look from a skill level at somebody like Steph Curry or Isaiah Thomas, their skills are off the charts. I mean, they're I'm biased, but some of the best athletes in all of sports. And I think the league is being rewarded by fans as a result because they love seeing those highly skilled players out there.
Yeah, let's talk about, and I want to take some audience questions, but I've somehow screwed up the iPad, so I'm not seeing them, so I might actually have you go out, raise some hands. But let me ask, so think of a question. Any question that you've sent in, submitted now, is basically for naught. Sorry. Adam, so I want to talk about sort of the NBA in the world,
yes.
All right? Because actually you've taken, I think, a somewhat different role from other sports commissioners. You've been actually more, I'll put a very fine point on it, a little bit more political. So there was an owner that was on tape with some horribly racist comments. You got rid of him as an owner, banned him from basketball. You were, you embraced the idea of Jason Collins as the first openly gay athlete in one of the 4 major sports, saying it was good for basketball and all that. You moved the All-Star game from North Carolina because of
a law that they passed.
HB2, the so-called bathroom bill. What's going on in your mind in all of that? And what kind of blowback did you get from that?
Well, first of all,
well, it's a really difficult fix, looks like. Yeah, thanks.
Dan, I like to think of it as value-based as opposed to political.
Okay.
I recognize how people could see it as being political.
Totally, yeah.
But for me, and I think it goes back to the history, the heritage of the NBA we talked a little bit about before, of not just the commissioners that have come before me, whether it be David Stern or Walter Kennedy or Larry O'Brien, but also the tradition of great players who were civil rights leaders, Bill Russell, and others, Oscar Robertson, players early on who adopted unions, who stood up for their rights. And I think I think there's a tradition in the NBA of being a progressive sport.
Yeah.
And so in the case of those decisions, while I recognize that there is a segment of the population that could view them as political decisions, to me, I was upholding the long-standing values of the league by making those decisions. And so in terms of blowback, sure, the internet gives everyone an opportunity, in essence, to express themselves. So, and certainly lots of people send me emails, and I'm at a lot of games, so I talk to fans. I would say, ultimately, I felt what I was doing were not personal political decisions of mine or even our owners, but decisions that were made consistent with the NBA as a brand, consistent with the NBA as a business. And I think no different than your expectation would be if it were Apple or Facebook or GE or other business. You would expect them to do things consistent with their brand values. So it's, I mean, I will say it's especially as even just in the last few years, as our society, has become even more divided, and that I find ourselves sometimes almost at the center of culture wars. And I'm realizing that also I have to balance what we're doing as a league against those fans who understandably are upset that they expect once they go into an arena or watching a game on television that's a safe harbor from politics. So it's, but we also, our players live in the world.
Right, absolutely. Well, let me pick up on that, because your players are, I mean, how do you reckon with, as a leader, with following? We talked about diversity here this morning. You have a league where roughly 75% of the players are African American, and if I'm not mistaken, one of the owners is. Is that where we are right now?
Right, Michael Jordan.
Yeah, Michael of Charlotte, bought it from an African American, another African American.
I would say we have the owner of Sacramento Kings, Vivek Ranadive. He's a person of color.
Yeah. But you have it's about 75% African American.
And 25% of our players were born outside the United States. It's a very diverse group as well.
Sure, but it's not a very diverse ownership group. So how much of that do you, how does that affect how you lead? It seems like it would be tricky. I mean, it's a little bit. It's a little bit. I would see it's a little bit uncomfortable when you have this overwhelmingly white ownership and overwhelmingly African American employees.
Well, I'd say those are, first of all, our principal owners. So, Grant Hill just became a significant owner in Atlanta.
Grant Hill, former NBA player, also went to school and played basketball at a university in North Carolina.
He's kidding, because I went to Duke.
He's a Duke graduate, yeah.
So, but
I just want to say for the record that Duke's performance this NCAA tournament was exactly the same as Northwestern's, my alma mater. So.
But just I'll finish my list. But David Robinson's part owner of San Antonio. So in all seriousness, I think it would be the same as you were talking to, looking at Fortune 500 companies and saying, look how many of them are run by men, or look how many
are run by white men.
Diverse.
It's the same issue.
So
I'm saying for this values-based stuff, 75% of the league, 75% of the players are African American. I mean, do you feel a responsibility, especially Donald Sterling?
Yes,
do you feel like,
no, absolutely. And our league is a partnership with the players. And so no question about it. And that very much influences my decisions. But I would just say it's also, we have a very diverse management group at the NBA as well. The deputy commissioner of the NBA is African American. The president of the WNBA is African American. So it's a diverse people.
The head of the Players Association is an African American woman.
So the people, it's not me alone that's making these decisions. And by the way, it's just as a selling point for diversity, and not diversity for its own sake, having those differing points of view in the room have been extremely important to me as we've made these difficult decisions. It's not a bunch of white men just sitting around making these decisions. And so,
so let me just pick up on that about white men making decisions. You something I know quite a lot about. You said earlier this week something very, very, I thought was incredibly provocative. You said that you wanted to see a woman as an NBA head coach, and these are your words, sooner rather than later. Woman as a head coach, sooner rather than later.
Well, okay, so what I said.
Please discuss.
Sure. I said that in response to a talk radio host in New York who had said, and I think, in fairness to him, more to be provocative, that there never be a female head coach in the NBA.
Right.
And my response is, first of all, we have, for example, there are 3 women who are assistant coaches in the NBA right now. Becky Hammon, who is former WNBA great player, assistant coach back to San Antonio under Coach Popovich. I think she's on a track to be a head coach one day. But my main point, too, and it was by the way, it was in conjunction with a partnership we had with Sheryl Sandberg on her Lean In initiative. And the notion there was, obviously, there's physical limitations on women playing in the NBA. Men and women have different physical capabilities in terms of muscle structure, height, weight, jumping ability, et cetera. But when it comes to coaching, that shouldn't be a limitation.
No way.
And the point I made was, even in my early days in the league, people used to say, there'll never be head coaches who weren't former NBA players. Of course, that's not the case anymore. Brad Stevens and others in Boston. And the notion here is, and by the way, I remember, speaking of Duke, when Mike Krzyzewski became coach of our national team, which is comprised almost entirely of NBA players, or now is entirely of NBA players, there were people out there who said NBA players won't listen to a college coach. And so to me, it's just ridiculous on its face to suggest that women won't coach in the NBA. Great coaches are great coaches. Now, having said that, I think we have a responsibility as a league to ensure that there are women in the pipeline, because you still need experience to become an NBA head coach. And so that's something I really want to focus our teams on as well. I commend those teams that have added women in the coaching ranks. I will say, again, it's not an issue with our players. If you talk to the young players in this league, it's not as if they have any resistance to being coached by women. I think there's a little bit of an old boys network, as there are in a lot of businesses. And the thing is, you have to, you know, in essence, shine light on that and sort of make sure people are focused on those decisions.
Would you consider something like the NFL has? The NFL has something called the Rooney Rule, which requires the teams to interview a person of color, I guess, for certain high-level jobs in the NFL. Would you consider something like that for women in the NBA?
I'm not sure, because I don't know enough about how effective the Rooney Rule's actually been in the NFL. I think I may be more effective using my bully pulpit as the commissioner to talk directly to our teams about it. I mean, things like that may be necessary. It's things that are worth studying.
No, I think I just think that conversation earlier this week as a door opener to having women, and the argument why women can be just as great coaches in the NBA as men. And you look at some of the college coaches, Trish Vanderveer at Stanford, Muffin McGraw at Notre Dame. Those are incredibly good coaches. Let's go to the audience for some questions here. When thinking about recruiting, this person asks, how are teams rebalancing the use of scouts to observe players versus looking at the data associated with recruiting?
The answer is they are rebalancing, but at the same time, there's a need for both that traditional intuitive skill that scouts have. I think that shouldn't be lost, sort of the touch and feel of a scout's ability to size someone up, to watch them play on the court, to watch them perform in the same way a fan would, but precisely balance with analytics. I think different teams sort of calibrate in different ways in terms of, I think some teams lean much more heavily towards the analytics side. They're still, and I don't think it's just the traditionalists who lean more towards sort of the gut feel of scouts, but I've listened to this debate back and forth for years now among some of our very sophisticated GMs, coaches, and scouts, and I think there's a role for both. But certainly any team that wasn't in the business of analytics 10 years ago is now, and they have large analytics staffs at every one of our teams.
It's just hard to imagine them not. I mean, I think it's a sea change in the same way as any other kind of business. I mean,
no question.
When you look at, say, just job interviewing for a Fortune 500 company, I mean, a lot of research has shown that job interviews for that kind of thing are essentially meaningless. They're kabuki theater, confirmation bias engines, and so I think the NBA, as for sports leagues, because they're so it's all talent.
Right.
I mean, there's the physical capital is almost non-existent. You need an arena and a ball, and it's so much talent. Here's another.
And just on that point, I mean, a Fortune 500 company may make a hiring decision, and worst case scenario, that person gets let go, and then they hire someone else. In the case of the NBA, and we've seen this with many of our teams, you live in a cap/draft system. You live with those mistakes for years.
Yeah.
So they'll take any edge they can get, any piece of information. So the number of analytics fields that they're looking at now, for example, when they're doing college scouting, when they're drafting internationally, it's incredible.
Okay, here's a question from somebody in the audience. Will we ever get a 4-point shot? And this is interesting. I think this is a good follow-up. How would you think about assessing the pros and cons of making that change?
So you set the stage very well by talking about the ABA the other day. So, if you look back at some of the quotes from the late 70s, when the 3-point shot was added, there were some of the traditionalists said, I'm done with this game. There's now a 3-point shot. I can't imagine it. In the same way, honestly, they talked about mascots being added to the game. So my initial reaction of 4-point shot now is no way, it'll never happen. I can't imagine it. Having said that, one of the advantages, we have a development league. It was just actually rebranded beginning next season as the Gatorade League, so we're calling it the G League. But we have now a league in which we can experiment with new options, things like 4-point shots. My gut is no time soon, largely because I don't think the game is broken right now. I think, in fact, there's a really interesting balance among dunking, 2-point shots, layups, 3-point shots. I think the game looks as aesthetically good as it's ever looked, frankly.
Oh, yeah.
And we're being, told that by our fans through ratings, through attendance, et cetera. So, I never say never. I think we as a league need to keep experimenting, looking at things. I think even in our development league, there's an aspect that's fun to see something new and different, maybe a 4-point shot.
And so the way that you would assess the pros and cons would be, it's interesting. I think there's a model for bigger or non-sports enterprises, which is you have this development, the G League and the D League, as basically
an opportunity, right? It's R&D.
Yeah, it's R&D.
Yeah.
It's a skunk works of sorts for other things.
No question.
So what about things like changing the dimensions of the court? Obviously very difficult in arenas.
It's interesting. Those things seem cyclical. There was about 10 years ago, there was a movement suggesting that the court was no longer big enough for these large players, that they'd become too fast, there wasn't enough room. I think then through some rule changes, players adjusted, and if you think of a basketball term, they call it spacing, but it's just what you think. And if you look at the spacing now of our players on the floor, especially because the need to cover good three-point shooting has taken defensive players away from the basket on the court. So to me, the court no longer looks too small. And so while there was discussion back some number of years ago that maybe the court's not big enough, now there's also, even if we were to determine that, wouldn't it be interesting if the court were to be 5 feet wider or 6 feet longer or something, that think of our arenas and the infrastructure that's been built in around a specific size court. So it would require a major overhaul. Obviously, if you do it, you have to do it, of course, for every arena. So it would be a significant change. But that's another thing where, in a development league context, we could experiment.
Yeah, another question here from the crowd. How do you incorporate analytics in your own hiring decision when you put together your leadership team?
So that's a good question. I think first, we have our workplace analytics. Most of my senior leadership team have been promoted from within. So we've been looking at analytics throughout their careers, various ways of measuring their work performance. In fact, Adam Grant is someone who we've been working a lot with lately, and he's helping us sort of reform the way we've been doing a lot of things traditionally. And then from the outside, it's interesting there. I have to confess, to the extent we've hired a few senior people, in the way I think you're using analytics, I can't say I've relied all that much on them. It's been more sort of the old-fashioned way of interviewing people, talking to references, looking at their background and their prior work experience.
Let me ask you, we're winding down here a little bit. So if you look at kind of the balance of power in the sport of basketball or professional sports in general, you've got the NBA, the league itself, helmed by you. You've got the Players Association, helmed by Michelle Roberts. So you got somebody looking out for the players. You got somebody looking out for the owners and the interests of the game. What about the fan? Who's looking out for the fans' interest?
Well, I'd say I am, and no differently than if you spoke to the CEO of a public company, and they'd say, yes, of course, I answer to the board and to the shareholders, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I weren't looking out for the customers. In this case, the fans, of course, are our customers, so I think it's my job to look out for them. But in fairness to our owners, too, I mean, there's a sophisticated group of people, and I think if you now have Steve Ballmer as an owner, I don't think he necessarily looks at it differently than when he was the CEO of Microsoft. And if you were to say to him then, who's looking out for your customers, he'd say, well, of course, I have responsibility to the shareholders, but what's good for the shareholders in that case is going to be good for the customers. But listen, I'm mindful of it. I think we just, and Michelle Roberts and I sat down together as we went into this most recent collective bargaining cycle, and I think there was a sense that to the extent that we hadn't gotten a deal done, and we did, and we got it done early, that when you have a work stoppage, not only is it incredibly painful for our fans, for our customers, but also I think the owners and the players do feel a responsibility. As I said earlier, if you aggregate all these employees together, you're looking at roughly 50,000 jobs out there that are all impacted if the business stops. So I think, so I would say I am. I'd say also there are proxies. I think the media, frankly, looks out for our fans. I think the bloggers do. Our fans who individually I encounter all the time. But to me, it's not that different than talking to any other business leader and saying, who cares about your customers? And the business leader saying, I wouldn't be doing my job if I weren't.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you for joining us. I just want to say that as an NBA fan, and one reason I asked the question about that I call politics and you call values is that I really think that if you look at some of the leadership moves of any executives in the last 10 or 15 years, I think one of the boldest, most creative, most courageous, most forward-looking was this man here stepping up very early in his job. And taking a stand against racial bias. I think that is great for fans, great for our kids. So for this and other reasons, give a big round of applause to Adam Silver.
Thank you.
Thanks for saying that.